Rainbows Support GB, and it offers schools a way of offering their children a place by a peer-to-peer support to think about their own personal bereavement or loss. And that can be any kind of loss. It can be around divorce or moving into or from a blended family, anything that creates some kind of loss. And it's a lovely charity. And then separate to that, I was trained by CRUSE, CRUSE, and I've got their link at the back, to become a bereavement volunteer. And that means I've counselled bereaved people for the last 15 years or so. And I'm passionate about talking about bereavement and sharing what it is, because so many of the people I meet, different races, ethnicity, gender, age, profession, culture, country, whatever, there is still this sense of I don't know what's happening to me. And during these extraordinary times, helping people know what it is to help others, I am very keen to share. I also work for the NHS as head of organisational development, and I'm offering it to staff as well, so they can help their colleagues and anybody else that may have suffered or is going to suffer a bereavement, and particularly during COVID. Let me just share with you what I'm hoping to cover. And if any of you just want to turn yourself on mute, got any questions, or you don't understand what I'm saying, turn yourself off mute and just ask me. Absolutely fine. Please don't wait if something's not making sense. But what I hope to cover in this time is, you know, knowing what to say. Partly it's knowing what it is. So I wanted to share what grief isn't, because there's an awful lot of myths about what people are going through or what it is, and I just wanted to briefly share that with you. Introduction to some bereavement models, not because I'm encouraging you to use them, but it can be really helpful for people, and you'll know what they are to help signpost people potentially to those and what that means. Types of grief and factors and can affect it. So particular types of loss can have a tremendous impact on people that we don't always see, and it's just sort of giving you the knowledge to know for things that you might want to look out for. And then how to help friends, families and colleagues what to say. And it's very simple, and I'll sort of talk about it as we go through as well. And then lastly, just give you some other support that's out there that you'll know about for anybody you know that may be suffering some kind of loss. So I rather liked this, so I just wanted to share it. If we understand the different ways people react to loss, we understand something about what it means to be human. Something about the way we experience life and death, love and meaning, sadness and joy. And that's the thing, for something that we all have to experience. Often we don't know how people react to loss. And like I said, I have all kinds of people come into counselling and yet talk about the same thing. They don't understand what's happening to them, and they're not sure who to talk to about it. And for something that is something that we'll all have, it's astonishing that we know so little about what it is. Some of the words we use and some of the words you'll hear, and they're so interchangeable. It's something that Rainbows, when they train facilitators, just let them know that bereavement is what happens to you. Grief is how you feel about that bereavement, and mourning is how you deal with that grief or loss or the yearning. And we do hear those words a lot, and I'm guilty. You'll probably hear me using one, but those are their meanings. Any surprises? I'm going to move on. So what grief isn't? It's not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. And certainly when people come into counselling, they can really believe that it is and be very worried about some of the symptoms that they're experiencing. And yet it is an emotional, physical and spiritual necessity. And it is the price we pay for caring for others. And one of the things that happens in counselling, and it can be what you can help people to do, is give them permission to grieve, because it is the only cure. If we don't grieve, we hold on and we have the symptoms without necessarily getting to a place of acceptance. So although grief isn't a disorder, there are absolutely some of the things that people you might know might begin to experience some of those things. And that's certainly around anxiety, depression, low mood, They are the things that typically people will feel if they're suffering a bereavement and have grief and going through the mourning period. And people can worry. And one of the things that you can do as a friend, as a colleague, as a family member, is just let them know it's okay, that they are typical, they are normal. There is something about normalizing it for people that is helpful. It's not unusual. That's what human beings can feel. Another aspect is grief is not on a schedule. So I often get people coming in and they're saying, I shouldn't be feeling this by now, or this is where I should be. And it simply doesn't work like that. And so one of the things that you can help people by is giving them permission to whatever they're feeling, that's what they're feeling. There are no rules about grief and where you should be. And people will stop themselves from admitting their feelings because they feel that they should be somewhere at a certain stage. And again, one of the kindest and best things you can do is just let you know that there is no timeline. I was happy to talk about my own bereavement. About 20 years ago, I lost my partner. And I asked my counsellor at the time about when did she start feeling better? And she gave me her time. And I wish she hadn't, because when I hit that time and I didn't feel better, I was quite crushed because I've given myself, I'll be okay by then. And it's not actually helpful. It's better to say it's yours and you'll feel better when you do. But there are things you can do that might help you get there quicker. And there is no hierarchy. So people will often rate their pain. Again, that nasty should, I should be feeling this, or I shouldn't be feeling this because it's not as bad for me. You know, I wasn't married to them, or I'm a first cousin once removed, or it's my dog. But people put a hierarchy of how they should be feeling. And again, one of the kindest things you can do and say, but you're feeling that, it's okay. And actually you do feel that, and reminding them that there is no should. And again, people want to say, I do this and I do this and then I'm okay. And unfortunately, everyone is different. And the image at the bottom you can see is that lovely linear line that I am here and then I am here and then I am there. And it doesn't work like that. So people might feel all right one day and they really don't feel all right the next day, or they say, I'm better now. And then suddenly, for some reason, something just reminds them of that person that they lost. And suddenly they feel like they've gone back. And again, it's that permission thing. That's what grief is. It can just come from the blind side and it's done to you rather than you are in control of it. And again, letting people know that you know that and normalizing it for people can be a really helpful thing for people, no more than that. Please do jump in if there's anything. So I just was going to offer you these to read. These are things that people can feel when they're grieving. Absolutely, Lucy, that's exactly what happens. People can come and say, I don't know what this is. And you have to help them unpick what it is and why. And often CRUSE, when there's been, as an example of that, when there's been some kind of big, it might be a war, or there may be some sort of big event, they will suddenly see more people ex-military who are bringing something that happened to them 10, 20 years ago, and they haven't dealt with it. And then suddenly it's triggered it. And then suddenly, I don't know why I'm feeling like this. And it happened a long time ago. And absolutely, because we're not taught at a young age to know what it is and what we will experience, people simply don't know what it is. And for a lot of people, they choose not to think about it anyway, because it's scary. It can be so intense and uncomfortable that people will do their best not to do it, and then say, I don't know why I'm feeling like this. I don't know why I'm always tired. I don't know why I feel depressed. I don't know why, you know, I don't know why I'm having these feelings. And part of it is saying, well, unsurprising, that is part of grief. It sounds to me like you're grieving. And again, as a friend, sometimes that can be helpful. Are you being supported at the moment? Is there any way you could go? Who are you talking to about this? Simple things like that. And again, it's that word normalizing. And at the bottom, I think it's a lovely illustration of when people are all going through these feelings, which is the loss oriented. So it's that left-hand egg, the grief work, the sort of dealing with all those feelings that may just come up and you're not in control of, and you're fine and you're laughing at one moment and then you're crying the next, and trying to deal with that. And then on the other side, it's the restoration oriented stuff, you know, attending to life changes. And that could be financial. It could be status driven. Suddenly you're single and all your friends are couples and you're suddenly not being invited to things anymore. It could be that the breadwinner, the main breadwinner, has died. It could be suddenly you're a single parent. It could be all host of things. But not only are you dealing with a loss, you're dealing with your new role in life. And of course, that can be more profound depending on where that person sat in your life. If they were in the same place as you, more of an impact. And consequently, it's exhausting. It's exhausting, and people don't know when they come and go, I don't know why I'm feeling so tired. Well, here are some reasons. And again, you know, it could be you're feeling so tired because you're all of these feelings, and also you're trying to deal with life again. That must be really tiring. And something as simple as that is, again, giving people permission to feel okay about what they're feeling. So I'm briefly going to offer bereavement models because they're so useful in counselling and because they really help people. And one that you may have heard of, it was really the first one that said human beings typically feel certain things, and that's by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. It's deemed old-fashioned now, because it was a frame that said you'll do this and then you'll feel this, and now people know that you can feel all of those things on the same day. You can go back to feelings, you can repeat and do it all over again, you can zigzag, you can do it in the whole day, but essentially that there are actual feelings that you are going to be feeling around denial that it happened, actually really accepting that someone's gone. So again, I can talk about my own because it was about 20 years ago now, but I was young and I lost my partner, and it was a sudden and traumatic death, and it took me, the counsellor said, I think you're in shock, and that was a year and a half later. I couldn't totally get it, and you may hear things where there's clues that they haven't quite got it, because it's too much for the brain to deal with. And just listening to something that you've heard before helps them understand that it has really happened. And a repetition might come in bargaining as well, you know, talking to people again and again, it sort of helps people come to terms with it and that it is really happened. Anger is very common, can be angry with the world, angry with themselves. You know, I was very angry. I was waiting for a man to come up to me and say, cheer up, love, it won't happen. So I could say, yes, it has happened. And of course, it never happened when I needed it, just all the other times. But I had an anger and I didn't know where to put it. And again, letting people know that that's okay. It's normal, as is depression, as is feeling guilty, all of those. And people can feel guilty. And maybe that's one, if you're close, you could help people unearth and maybe talk about, because it's one of the ones, guilt, shame, that people tend to keep to themselves. But it's typical to feel guilty at some level of, only I've done this. You know, if they'd argued the night before, if I hadn't had that argument, they died thinking I didn't love them, and all kinds of guilt. It's normal, and people forget the rest of the years they've had with them. And then another way, sort of more modern way of looking at it, is tasks. There are tasks of mourning, things that we go through to get to a place, if not acceptance, of living in the world again. Just checking anyone wants to ask. And that Warden is about accepting that reality of the loss. Task 2, working through the pain of grief. It can be something that people don't want to go to because it can feel feral and painful. Adjusting to the environment, you know, particularly if it's your partner, and that sense of status, but it could certainly be a child as well, and others, and then finding a connection whilst embarking a new life. What does it mean to me now they've gone? How are they? How am I going to keep them and live a life as well? And that can be a really difficult thing for people to come to terms with. If I start living my life, somehow I've let go of them, and I've already lost them once and I can't let them go. So look out for, if you think people aren't letting them go because they think that, you know, or not beginning to live their own life because somehow they feel that they're being unfaithful. It can be quite a normal thing to do, and reminding them that Joe or Nancy would want them to live, and what would they be telling you right now might be appropriate, it might not. And it's those cultural things that we're told that people are carrying, as well as all those other shoulds that they're carrying, because it's the family culture as well as the greater community culture and the country's culture about once you're a widow, you're a widow for life. And sort of trying to help people work that through so they make their own decisions about what it means to them. And again, that's when the permission bit comes in, giving people permission to decide what it means to them. And whatever it is, ritual is important, a place where we can share that pain and it's acknowledged, and there's a place, and it's all we're witness to each other as well. And of course, during COVID, that's not been possible for so many people, and they're carrying guilt anyway because it's normal. We just feel guilty when someone dies. What if only I'd done? What could we have done? And then you couldn't either commiserate, celebrate, be part of saying goodbye, and then people carry that with them still because there's not a chance. And so there is that thing of our particular circumstances and that loss of ritual or opportunity to ritual. It has an important part to play. So the next bit is I just wanted to share a bit of types of grief and factors that can affect it, because it helps you know what to look out for, essentially. And there are things that everybody's different, like I keep on saying, but there are certain factors that as a friend or a family member, it's kind of useful to know. So some of the factors that can affect how people grieve, it is about who the person was. And not only the person, it could be a dog, but that dog could be somebody's best friend, or a parrot or a fish, but they feel like they're not able to grieve and share that emotion of anybody else, because to other people they have a sense that it's just a dog or a fish, but it's not, it's their best friend. And so who the person was, and it makes the difference about how people feel that they can grieve or not grieve. And again, just something to be aware of. And then the nature of the attachment, it could be that they are their only link to the outside world. It could be that they have unresolved feelings about that person. It could be a whole host of things, but that nature of that attachment might, because people can remember someone saying, oh, but they were just a second cousin. But that second cousin was someone they were brought up with. It was like a brother. But they weren't allowed to grieve like that. And so again, it's all so personal to the person, and sort of just knowing that or hearing that can help. Always the mode of death. I will talk to you about sudden and traumatic death. I experienced it, and there are certain things that you might feel around that. Suicide, of course, is another example that can bring great guilt and not talking about it, and a whole host of things. Previous losses, sometimes I can counsel people, particularly when they're older, and it might just be one of many losses. And of course, there's an accumulative effect, and sort of being aware of that might help you know that that person might be suffering, or perhaps you're aware, and like the couple of you have mentioned, it might bring up other losses from the past that maybe you weren't allowed to talk about. Personality of the person, and of course that's going to have an effect. Social variables, so for some people it will mean that it will change their whole role in society, their role within a church, or if they do or don't have people that are there to support them around, so greater feelings of alienation, or perhaps less so if they've got lots of family around them. It could have financial, suddenly they're not in the same financial bracket as everybody else, they're the only single person. So all those kind of variables can really affect people. And again, it's just about being aware that this might be happening. You don't know until you ask, but it's about looking out for someone and wondering what's happening for them. And then concurrent stress, it may be that they have the stress of grief and the mourning process that they're going through, but they do have financial worries, or they are a single mum or a single dad, or they don't have, and it's those other things that they may be having in their life. And then there's disenfranchised grief, and I'm going to talk specifically about that because it comes with its own things. So sudden and traumatic death. No one ever told me that grief felt like fear. C.S. Lewis. He writes a beautiful book, and books can be something that you could potentially suggest to friends and family. Sometimes it can help people reading about other people. I read it, I lost my partner, and I read about him because he diarised his grief, his mourning process after the death of his wife, and it happened to help me. With sudden and traumatic death, there can be a greater sense of disbelief about the loss. I was suddenly had a police officer. I don't mind talking about my stuff, by the way, and I do it so it's I'm not bringing out anybody else's stuff. It's easy for me to share it as examples, just so you know. But it took me a very long time to really accept that Ad had died. He was young, I was young, and it was a sudden traumatic accident. But nevertheless, it took me years to really accept it. And just knowing that can be helpful, because and again, if people are saying the same thing, it might be a sign for you to look out for. And there can be heightened emotions around guilt and anger. You sometimes see families. I think about Steve and Lawrence, and the father and the mother, they ended up splitting, but for years trying to change the system, and sometimes it can be to channel the anger that they're feeling because it's so out of control, the tragedy that happened. Intense loneliness and isolation. So I felt that because I was the youngest widow I knew, and I had nobody to share it. I didn't really want to share it, but I had no one to share it. It seemed so unique to me. A need to blame someone is, again, perhaps around the Stephen Lawrence's, a need to explain it because it's so random. How could this happen? It doesn't make sense, and I need to make sense of this, and blaming someone can help. And with it comes complete exhaustion, and it can be physical as well as emotional and mental. And if in the workplace you suddenly see people not thinking, not being able to concentrate, this is the children too, it's because of all those emotions I showed you earlier, and all of these trying to adapt in this new world means that your thinking can just fall to pieces. And there can be a sense of meaningless and emptiness, particularly for those of us who maybe don't have a faith or something to hanging on to and say, well, what's life about then? It can have a real, your own spiritual journey to work out what life means to you as well. And things like medical or legal authorities, so there's a question about how that person died or how they were treated, means that it doesn't come to resolution, and then people feel that they can't grieve, and it can go on for longer because they need to know the outcome of the case that says whether that person was neglected, say in the hospital, or whose fault it was about the car accident. But those kind of things can really keep people on hold and not grieving. And I share these things for you to have better awareness of the things that might be affecting your friends or family, that might be really impacting on their ability to grieve. Because grieving and all the feelings, it's normal. But it's about, are they able to move on, and are they really struggling, maybe need a little bit more help. And disenfranchised grief was something I talked. It's when, for instance, a loss of a dog or a pet, it's not seen and worthy, so they're not able to grieve publicly because they feel that their loss, their profound loss, will be dismissed. Or if it's stigmatized because it's a same-sex relationship or intra-religious marriage or partnership, and families aren't supportive, and suddenly they're not able to go once again to that important ritual, they're not involved, and there is no place for them to do their grief. And it can be that they're holding on to it with no place to take it. And again, potentially just listening could be the difference. And it's something that you can offer. You don't have to be a counsellor, but you need to feel safe too. How they died. So of course, suicide can come with lots of feelings of shame or guilt, and that can really stop people being able to grieve because of these other feelings. Or if you're not recognised as a griever, you know, they were just a friend, their family, it must be worse, but actually for you it's impactful because they were like a sister, say. And very much actually when you mention Nabi, it's about how you're grieving. So one person's extreme, which is actually cultural and part of the process, in their work culture say that's just not acceptable, and so there's no place, and like Maria said in her family, her dad saying you shouldn't be feeling this now, we should be like this, so suddenly you're not able to actually share your grief, feel your guilt, because you've been told you shouldn't for whatever reason. And again, as friend or family, again, knowing that are these people allowed to share their grief? Is there something that perhaps is stopping them? And all of the sudden, the traumatic and the disenfranchised may end up with complicated grief. So this is the bit where, as a counsellor, we're looking for is that, so all of the things I've said before are normal. And one of the things that you can help people is let them know, yes, I've heard this is what grief is like. I've heard it can be like this. Yes, I've heard that every day you might feel different and it's exhausting. Yeah, I've heard this from a friend. I know, yes, or I experienced this too, that kind of normalising it. But complicated grief is when a person is stuck essentially. It's described here as a prolonged period of intense acute grief symptoms, which can go on for years and decades, but it's about not being able to move on. And in the warden's process, it's to a place of not acceptance as a place of living. And there can be persistent and intense yearning. I recognise this because 2 years after I died, I was having dreams where he left me, and I'd wake up not knowing if he'd left me or he'd died. So it was very exactly, that's because it was a sudden and traumatic death, and people had to tell me what had happened. And I understand that one. And where is he? And although I didn't do it in my waking life, I did it in my dreaming life, and I had it for a long time. Intrusive thoughts and preoccupation of memories of the deceased, again, that repetition, if you're seeing people talking about the same things, but people can literally see images of things that disturbed them when they died, or aspects of that death that they just can't get over. Avoidance of situations, so someone that could never go to a funeral again, or could never go to a certain place. I'd died on a train and I knew I could make that a thing. It was an accident, but I chose not to make it a thing because I needed to use trains for my workplace, but I had to take my mum like a child on the train to just not make it. I was able to make a conscious decision that it wasn't a problem, but it can be, and there suddenly can be an avoidance of certain places or things that trigger it, and they can't move on. That sense of loss of meaning is gone, and they are left feeling somewhat empty. And it's that where I would say people really do need to think about somewhere where they can take that and work it through, because it can be a very lonely place. Let me just make sure. Key learn. We've got 8 minutes left. With your permission, would you let me just get through to the end and then ask you for the key learning? Is that okay with everybody? Yeah. Because I think the next bit is, I've tried to interweave it in what you've learned so far, but what you can do, and it is so sort of simple. Remember that the irony of grief is that the person that you need to talk to about how you feel as a person who is no longer there. And that is one of the terrible ironies. The person you want to tell about this is the person that's not there. And just knowing that is helpful. First of all, I'd say be aware of how you are feeling. So before you want to reach out an arm, just be sure that you're okay with your own feelings about your own bereavement or where you're at. Someone came up to me 3 weeks after I'd died and said, well, at least you're over the worst. She didn't mean it. I know she'd gone home and kicked herself. She just didn't know what to say. And so she ended up saying something. She's probably kicked herself for a long time, but I didn't need to hear I was over the worst, because I really wasn't. But she didn't come from a bad place. It's just she didn't know what else to do. But also it can mean that you can get very upset, and then it may be good. It may be that you share it, but know how you're feeling is the point. And there are no right answers. So people are terrified of speaking to people. People always ask me, but what do I say? There is no right answer. And so don't assume you know, just ask, how are you? And it seems so pat, and one of you mentioned it in the beginning, but it is the truth. How are you? How is it? And then be sensitive to the surroundings. If you ask them at a time that they might be able to open up, is it away from anybody else? You know, is it in a room? Is there an opportunity for them, if they do get upset, to be able to get to a better place with you in the room? Is it appropriate to ask them? Or is it appropriate to just say, look, I would, you know, if you ever wanted just someone to listen, how about a cup of coffee sometime? I'd really like that. And leave it to them to find the right place. That offer of support, and to say that you are there, I can tell you from the place I was at, is so helpful. And you just don't know what they need. And I'll give you an example. When I died, I could not see my empathetic friends. I did not want to see my own pain reflected back in their eyes. I didn't want to see it. What I wanted, and what I could only see, was my mum and my more pragmatic friends who didn't do that empathy bit, who were there going, who reminded me of who I was, because I just didn't know who I was at that time. My empathetic friends understood that, where I was able to articulate what I needed, and later I absolutely appreciated their empathy, but I didn't want it at the beginning. And I met another young widow where they sort of tried to almost put us together, and we avoided each other. It was the last thing we wanted, to see someone else's pain. It was just too early. So don't assume. It is about, you know, what can I do? What do you need? And often it's listen, witness, and maybe be able to say, I've heard that's normal, or sounds like you could do with support, or where do you go for support? And letting them know that some days are just worse than others. So in the workplace, you know, that I should be okay, and then something triggers them and they burst into tears, and often they'll go, I'm really sorry, and you reminding them that's okay. Some days are just worse than others. You don't need to be an expert. It's just being okay with whatever they're feeling, being a witness, validating their feelings, listening, and knowing you are there are the profound things. And to be honest, that's what I do in counselling. What I offer is perhaps models so they know where they're at, or normalising it, but there's very little else that people need. They will get themselves through it, but being offered that makes a tremendous difference. For supporting disenfranchised grief specifically, because it's different and intense, acknowledging the person's feelings are true and significant. Yes, it's a dog, but to you, it is your best friend. That fish was with you for the last 10 years. I can see that is a massive loss to you. Just being able to acknowledge that pain is sitting in that person, that witness bit is so important for someone with disenfranchised grief. Reminding that person, so that listening, they are worthy of time. Yes, I know it was your second cousin or it was your in-law, but clearly it wasn't just that for you. I can see you're suffering. Why don't we just go and talk about it? Maybe creating a ritual with them. Why don't we go and lay some flowers, you and I, and just let you have your own ritual to say goodbye. Seeking personal ways to explore grief and express their emotions, and helping them work out what could you do that would help you say goodbye. You were never given the chance. What would help you? This comes from CRUSE, and I just wanted to share it with you about the kind of ways that children understand death at different ages. You can get this from the CRUSE pages, but it can be quite helpful to know how they're making sense of it, to be able to speak to them in their language, in a way that they understand. Again, I will send you all these slides and you can get all of this, and there's a lot more on CRUSE about how to speak to children that have suffered bereavement. And here are some of the other organisations. CRUSE is the one that I was trained by. It's brilliant for one-on-one bereavement counselling. Grief Encounter does the same for children and young people. It's nationwide. There's Widowed and Young, so they're more the support groups that have been built up. Winston's Wish, which is for children, but it's got an awful lot on there for teachers. Rainbows, of course, the one that I come from, and it's got stuff on there you can get. We've got free silver linings, so during a crisis like flooding, there's a whole package of support that you can just pull off, and it tells you how to help people through that crisis, and flooding is an example of that, and that's all free. Silver lining package on the Rainbows. And then something like miscarriages as well. I will share these models for those, and actually for some people, reading about bereavement, I read books and books on the science of it and the research because it really helped me, but knowing these sort of psychological models can be helpful, and I will include that in the slides. And lastly, I want to say, my feet will want to walk to where you are sleeping, but I shall go on living. Thank you.